Well, hello, Liberty listeners. Welcome to another episode of Liberty Road. Today, you guys get to hear from Lisa Congdon, the artist. If you don't know who she is, you're going to fall in love with her. You'll probably reflect back on some products or some things you've seen with her brilliant, beautiful, bright designs. And now you get to know the woman behind the art. Lisa, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So for those who don't know you, let's just get started. Back up a little bit and tell us about becoming an artist. Were you always an artist? When did you know that you were an artist? And when did you kind of take that on full time?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to say I'm getting over being sick. I feel great, but my voice is a little raspy. So if I have to stop to drink my tea or take a slight cough break, that is why I don't normally sound like this. So, I mean, when I look back now, I think I've always been an artist. I don't think that I always identified as an artist or was intentionally an artist, but once an artist, always an artist. So we'll start there. I had a very average upbringing, 2 parents married, a very creative mom who did expose me and my siblings to a lot of things, including art. So art has sort of always been in my blood. But that said, of the 3 children, I always felt probably the least creative, the least gifted, the least talented. It is sort of stunning in a way when you consider my childhood, compared to my siblings, what I do with my life. Because I was the kid who was always outside playing with the neighbor kids. I wasn't necessarily inside, creating imaginary worlds with my stuffed animals or anything like that. I was a pretty normal kid with normal aspirations. I thought of myself as a pretty terrible artist, especially compared to my younger sister who was, showed not just an interest, but a proclivity toward art at a pretty young age. And I was definitely identified as the tomboy, the hard worker, but probably the least remarkable kid in the family. And that was okay. It's not like I was necessarily traumatized by that. So I go to high school, I go to college, I maybe take an art class here or there, but nothing ever really resonates for me.
What's your major in college?
History.
Okay.
And I didn't know what I was going to do with it. I guess that's the beauty of a liberal arts degree. You don't really have to know. You just you learn for the sake of learning. And so I graduated from college, and within a couple of years, I met the woman who I ended up being in a relationship with for a decade. And she was an artist. Not only did she have her BFA in painting, she was a rising star in the graphic design world in San Francisco, which is where I lived at the time. And so even though I had sort of a rudimentary exposure to art as a child, this was full on. She also grew up in Greenwich Village in New York City, spent her childhood going to museums, knew a lot about art. And so our relationship began, and I had this sort of education. And, really it was her showing me things she was working on, books that she would also collect books by artists and graphic designers. And so this stuff was sort of surrounding me. And I remember the first time I ever went to her apartment, I was those cool places that you see in magazines that have, really cool posters framed on the walls and books and certain, this was back in the very, very early 90s, and I hadn't been exposed to a ton of that, but I remember walking into her apartment and just being oh, this person is cool. They have an aesthetic. And I had never seen that before or been exposed to that at all. And it lit me up. And so clearly, there was something similar inside of me. I just hadn't learned anything about it or expressed it yet. And so I just learned a lot about art from being in that relationship. And we broke up about after a little under 10 years together, remained friends, etc. But in the wake of that breakup, I was like, oh, I think I want to take a painting class because I found myself with all this time on my hands.
Lisa, what were you doing for work during those 10 years?
Great question. Right up until the time of this breakup, I had been an elementary school teacher. So
okay.
I taught mostly first and second grade, fourth grade for a couple of years.
Okay.
And that was like a really creative profession, by the way. Like, to make learning interesting for kids, you got to make things artistic in a way. And so I feel like that was when I sort of first dabbled in a creative practice. Around the time that we split up, I got a job at a nonprofit organization that worked in public schools. And that was actually when it was like the breakup, and then also getting this job where creativity wasn't necessarily an inherent part of, or making things and getting my hands dirty wasn't necessarily an inherent part of what I was doing every day. So I decided to take some art classes, which I did. And, just like any normal person, I was terrible at it. In fact, the first art class I ever took, I took with my brother. And we were sort of like sitting in the back of the class. He's 2 years older than I am. And he also lived in San Francisco at the time. And, we sat in the back of the class sort of, laughing the whole time and not really taking it very seriously. I really enjoyed the teacher, though, so I ended up taking some more classes from him. Years later, he saw that I was in a exhibition at the MoMA in San Francisco and wrote me an email and was like, what happened in the last 15 years? This was like 15 years later, but, and I had to explain to him what had happened because he knew me as this sort of mediocre painter. Anyway, I just sort of fell in love with the process of making. And this was also in the early 2000s. The DIY movement was sort of surging on the internet. People were starting blogs and sharing things that they were making. And I kind of fell into that world. And I was experimenting with all kinds of things, from sewing. I got really into like improvisational quilting, and I was drawing and painting, not in the way that I do now, but, sort of starting that, making collage.
All on the side. All
on the
fun.
side. I had a full-time job. Yeah. Like, I worked for a photographer for a while, was like, should I be a photographer? I just knew that, not necessarily that I wanted a creative career, but that I wanted to do more of this, and that it was super fun. And I had this like desire to get better at it too. I was super motivated. I understood that I was not super talented when I started. Ira Glass of This American Life tells this great story on one of the episodes about, the beginner gap, and how, your taste is always like, way further along than your skill level when you're a creative person, whether you're a writer or a visual artist or whatever. And that most people, even if they have the desire to make stuff, they're so intimidated by how to get from where they are to their taste level that they stop because it's too painful, because you have to go through all this like messy stuff. And maybe it's because I was a little older when I started this process. I was in my early 30s, which seems so young to me now, but I was, quote, older for, sort of starting as an artist. But I understood that I was going to have to, like, things were going to be ugly for a while before they got better. And so I just sort of like dabbled in a lot of things until I really just settled on drawing and painting. And I was also sort of in this period of a few years introduced to this idea that you could actually be an artist for a living. And now it's super popular because of the internet, and people know it's possible because so many people do it and share their work. But I thought you had to go to art school. I actually thought about applying to art school at the time. Like, should I go get my BFA? Should I like surpass that and try to get an MFA in something? And I was talked out of it by some friends. But started just creating a portfolio of things that I posted online, and was introduced to somebody who is now, I know, is a very well-known illustration agent. At the time, I had no idea, and I don't think she was as well-known then. She's actually retired now, but she ended up being my first agent because at the time, social media didn't exist in the way that it does now. This was probably 2007 or so. Instagram didn't even exist.
No,
And
no.
and a friend of mine who I had made on the internet, who was a professional illustrator, was like, "You need an agent if you're going to do this."
What were they seeing that they thought you needed an agent? Like, what were you producing?
I was like, I wanted to be an illustrator. I had this
Okay.
friend who was a professional illustrator, and she, made things that ended up on the covers of journals, and had done some book covers. She had written a children's book. She was licensing her work for different applications. And I just sort of had this picture from following her and then slowly sort of following other professional illustrators that like this was a possible career path for me if I could just hone my style a little bit. So I just
Yeah.
worked really hard at that. And she mentored me and ended up introducing me to this person who became my agent. And this woman really took a chance on me because I had very little in my portfolio. My work was still pretty, I look back now and I feel like it was so beginner, but she saw something in me that, that she thought had promise. And, anyway, by this point, I'm in my late 30s, and I end up signing with this agent, and she then sort of takes over the role of mentoring me. And that was sort of really the beginning of the path of being an illustrator. And I learned what it meant to be an illustrator, and the process of working with clients, and started getting some work through her and my first, for a few big jobs. And eventually I left her and a whole other series of things happened, and I built the studio that I run now and have employees, and I have I've been through a few agents actually since then, and I have another one now, but that's sort of how it started, like a little bit on accident, until I realized, oh, this is a possible career path.
Yeah.
And then even if you haven't gone to school for it, you can do this on your own. And I just set about that and did it.
Do you think in hearing your story, and I'm imagining our listeners are hearing this and saying, well, is Lisa an outlier? Like, can I find something in me that maybe is an interest in being creative? Maybe I haven't even self-identified as a creative or as an artist. And would you say to that person, just keep at it. Just keep going. If you have an interest in it, you're inclined to do it. You talked about like it was for you something you wanted to get better at.
Mhm.
Like it was something that you appreciated. Um, do you think that's a path for people that they can sort of be nurtured into that? Or do you think, well, it was latent. It was in me. I was a creative. I just hadn't bloomed until a little bit later.
Mm. Well, I think one of the first things I said when we started talking was that I feel like I've always been an artist. I do think that if it had been nurtured in me earlier, or
Yeah.
somehow I had the right art teacher, or I had made like it was like when I connected with the partner that I was in a relationship with for 10 years, like she introduced me to this world that I had never been introduced, which
Yeah.
then led to me becoming an artist. After we split up, but like I do think for most people there has to be some spark that like lights something up in you that makes you think like, I want to have some kind of creative career, or even if it's not something you make money from, that something that you do and spend your time doing. There has to be something that motivates you, whether it's like a picture of what your life might look like later, or the kind of work that you think you want to make, or just the idea of having a creative practice. I think that's sort of always been possible in me for sure. I don't necessarily think it was latent. Um, I think I was just focused on other things and
Yeah.
then kind of figured it out late in life. But I do think once you identify that in yourself, it really is just a matter of like figuring out how to carve a path for yourself.
How to get there. And as you
Yeah.
said, there's so many ways to do that today. Like
Yeah, 100%.
being an artist when we were little was, it was the kids who could draw or the kids who could
That's right.
paint in art class,
That's
right?
right.
That's it.
That's right.
And you probably were like, oh, my brother and sister can do that, so I'm gonna do other stuff, and didn't realize that there was a medium for you or a way to come up with a Lisa aesthetic that could be reproduced in so many different ways on so many different mediums.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like I ended up giving myself permission to do this thing that I think timing was definitely key because I'm a, as most of your listeners are probably either, Gen Xers or boomers. And
Yeah.
I'm an elder Gen Xer. I'll be 58 in January. And we're from that generation where like, we lived most of our, early lives in adulthood without the internet as we know it now.
Yeah.
And so to like understand that it's possible to have a career as a writer or an artist, or a filmmaker or whatever it is, without sort of going to NYU and getting your degree or going to RISD and getting your illustration degree, like, you would have to have that thing nurtured in you at a younger age, right? And then go to school for it, and then you'd meet all of the people that would help you get to where you wanted to go, because there was no other way to have access to those people, when we were younger, because there was no internet. And then, here I was like in my mid-late 30s, when the internet was becoming a space where you could make those connections and see a picture of like how you might do something without spending, 50 grand on school or whatever. Not that I was opposed to going to school, but more just that like I was like older and I wanted to try to figure out how to do it myself.
Yeah. And can you use that $50,000 to play and figure out in the medium, in the space, and say, well, what is this for me?
Yeah. And like, so I think a lot of us, and I'm not alone, like I think there are other people who are pretty successful creative careers who didn't figure it out until they were in their 30s or 40s, because that's, when the internet was becoming a space where that you could use to figure that stuff out. And so like now we have all these tools, and I mean, I've written books for artists on how to do the thing. We have all these tools that didn't exist before that we have access to. And that's really exciting, because I also think that like the older you get, the more in touch you are with like what you have to give to the world. And like, if you can figure out a way to do that, amen. Yeah.
Amen. Yeah. Okay. So I have to ask you, when's your birthday?
January 17.
Oh, I'm January 15 and I'll be 58 too. So
oh my gosh, we're like literally almost birthday twins. That's amazing.
Yeah. Isn't that
I love that.
And my daughter went to NYU, by the way. That's so
cool.
When you said that, I was like, I was like, I wanted to do that. So you talked about your books really quickly, and I wanted to get into that one particular book. But you've written 10. So let me just start there. Are all of those for artists? And what was the intention? What was it behind that? Like, I'm really going to get it. Because we write one to sort of tell a story of our career and to connect with people. But 10 is like, this is another career. Like, you've decided to also write books.
And interestingly, I did it alongside everything else. Now, to be clear, not all of them were like books full of words. Some of them are books full of illustrations. Some of them are about 50-50. So they all included either making art or writing a lot of words, in some cases both. Only 2 of my books are specifically for artists. So Art Inc., The Essential Guide to Building Your Career as an Artist, that one, and Find Your Artistic Voice are both books that I wrote for artists. But I fell into making books on accident, actually. When one of the things I discovered pretty early on, and now that sort of is, I think, common practice for artists or people aspiring to be artists, I was doing these like 30-day challenges or these like yearly challenges where I would do something every day for a year and then post about it on the internet. I had a blog back in the day. And the first one of those that I did was called 365 Days of Hand Lettering. And at the time I had already was working with my agent, and one of the things she suggested to me, and it's funny, now I am like known for my hand lettering and like most of my work includes words. But when I was first starting out, I was not good at that. And it didn't come naturally to me. And she just suggested that I practice that. And I was like, well, I'm going to make a public challenge where I like hand letter something every day for a year and I'll post the results. And then if I do something enough, if I practice something enough, eventually I'll settle on a style. And that is in fact what happened. And, this was in 2010 or so. And around this time, was like when hand lettering inspirational quotes was like becoming a thing. And I was like right on the sort of like precipice of that. And the project didn't start out that way, but eventually it's like when you're hand lettering something every day, you're like, what am I going to hand letter today? And I'd be like, oh, I'm just going to go find some quote that I like from a book I read or whatever. And so I just sort of, in the latter half of that project, that's basically what it ended up being. And then I was illustrating them and posting them. And I had already worked on a couple of projects at Chronicle Books, mostly stationery projects. And an editor there who I'd never worked with contacted me and was like, I'm following this project that you're doing, and I think it would make a really cool book of hand-lettered quotes, of which now there are a million. At the time, there weren't many.
Right.
And I said, okay, let's talk. So we went out to lunch one day. This is Chronicle's based in San Francisco, and I used to live there. I live in Portland, Oregon now. And so then I left the lunch, and I was like, okay, it looks like I'm going to have a book deal. And so we took the best of, there was obviously, the book has like 100 quotes, and it's called Whatever You Are, Be a Good One. And if you look at it now, my name's on the cover. You might be able to tell it's my work, but like it looks really different than the work I do now because it was 15 years ago and my work has evolved. I was sort of way more at the beginning of my career then. But it was a big break for me. And the book was like, I don't know if it still holds this record, but it was the best-selling art title that Chronicle had ever published. Like something about the title, Whatever You Are, Be a Good One, was very aspirational. So people were buying it as like graduation gifts.
Yeah, absolutely.
Things
and probably
like that.
Tearing things out and hanging them on walls, framing them.
Exactly. Yeah. And Target carried it forever, which is, in the world of like book sales, like a really something you want. And because that book did so well and it was my first book, my editor was like, let's do another book. And so we ended up doing a sequel to that, which was the same format, but didn't do as well. That you should never copy something that does well and try to do it again because it's never going to fly. But even so, we did another book and another book. And like that editor is now moved on. And interestingly, we're writing a book together right now. But I worked with her for years. And when you forge a relationship with somebody like that, who believes in you, and then I a couple other books that I published have also done really well. It just sort of like is like, what are we going to work on next? And I really organizing and writing books ended up being something that I was not only good at, but that I loved. And believe me, writing books is hard, and a lot of people hate it. Like they fantasize about like writing a book, and then they go to write it, and they realize that it's a lot of work and a lot of time management and stuff, deadlines. And but I ended up kind of like thriving in that space. And so that's how I ended up writing so many books. It was just like the first book I ever made did really well, and then the rest is history.
I love the idea that you did this 30-day challenge. In the case of the book, it was a 365-day challenge, but it's a good reminder to us to just put stuff out there. You weren't afraid as an artist to try something new. And maybe that's because you were just starting out and it was okay. But to just just challenge ourselves to something and see what develops in us and how people respond. I mean, we have the opportunity to see, like, does this resonate with folks? Is
That's
this
right. And
something that's meaningful?
there's really no loss in it either. You're only
Yeah.
gaining, you're getting to practice the thing that you want to put out into the world. So
Yeah. The one book that you said is specifically for artists was the Finding Your Artistic Voice, and I was curious about that. What could, like, give us two takeaways, let's say, from that book that perhaps a non-artist that's listening could apply. Like, what? So it's the finding your voice part that I guess I'm most interested in. What is it that you saw in yourself that needed that sort of, was it permission? Was it practice? And how do you, for others who are artists who might be coming to you or want to be artists, what do you say to them about finding your voice? And what I'm looking for is something that applies to all of us, because finding our voice right now feels, um, it's so important if we haven't had that opportunity up until now.
find your artistic voice was actually another idea that Bridget, my former editor, came to me with. And I had written this question on Instagram for my followers.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what do you want to learn from me? Because at that point, I was like, I want to develop some classes or some modules, because people are always asking me questions. I had pretty, relatively good success later in life. People were really interested in how I got to where I was.
Yeah.
And one of the things that people wanted to know a lot of things, but one of the themes that I kept hearing over and over in people's responses to that question was some form of, like, how did you develop your style? Like, you have not just an artistic style, but you have like a point of view.
Yes. I know what your house looks like in my
Right.
mind based on some of the pieces you've created.
I mean, I dress a certain way. You know, I am wearing pink and red, which are my favorite colors, which you see all the time in my work. Yeah, I like how I decorate my house. It's like a whole package. And I think a little bit was also like my written voice, the things that I was writing about, like the topics that were interesting to me, from mental health to social justice to thriving at an older age, like all of those things.
Yeah.
So I wrote a little blog post about kind of like my basic thoughts about how I developed that. And I don't think it was more than 1,000 words. And my editor wrote to me literally the next day. She obviously was paying attention to everything that I was putting out into the world. And she was like, I think this is also a book. Believe me, this was not the first time she came to me with an idea. And not all of the ideas that she came to me with ended up as books. But I got really excited about this one. And I think the blog post like became the sort of outline for the book.
Mm-hmm.
But I also realized that there was a lot I didn't know about how this worked for other people, or like, what did the research say about how the brain works, like the creative brain. And so I got really excited about like diving into this topic, because I was able to like unpack my own story, and it gave me an opportunity to really think about, how do I approach my craft, and like, how did I get from the person who I described in the beginning of this podcast, who like was making really bad paintings, to a person who has this very identifiable style that major, companies want to collaborate with me. So like, how did I get there? And I think if I could summarize in one sentence the message in the book, it's like, you have to just practice over and over and over. You have to sort of do something over and over and over in order for it to become yours. I read a lot of research about creativity, and sort of like what are the characteristics of highly creative people. And then the end of the book is really like a lot of practical things you can do to speed up that process. And from engaging in multiple 30-day challenges, yearly challenges, to taking classes, to joining a critique group, to, like a whole slew of things. And those were all things that I had done and had success with. And, the line that I sort of use at the end of the book is this quote by Ralph Waldo Emerson, which is every artist was first an amateur. And I think we imagine when we see somebody who is a great artist or a great writer, a great illustrator, graphic designer, photographer, whatever, that they've always made work that looked something like that. But in most cases, there are very rare cases of prodigies, like people who literally are geniuses and sit down to draw or make or do at the age of 9 or whatever. And from that point forward are just
comes out. Yeah.
Yeah. And those people do exist, but they are 1000% the anomaly. Most people have to toil and suffer through the creative process and through trial and error and just a lot of showing up and practicing and being frustrated and thinking very poorly of yourself and your work before you get to the place where you even like what you're doing and you feel proud of it, and or that you can even make a living out of it for that matter. And then if you want to make something of your passion or your talent or whatever, you just gotta like muck through it and eventually you'll get there.
Yeah, I like that you gave us both insight and permission into the messy. Like that's a part of this process. The willingness to be messy. You talked about even going and getting your work critiqued, like the willingness to hear other people. Really, it's speaking into your life, whether it's, feels good or not in the moment. And then also putting in just the time, the hours. And my guess is you find breakthroughs along the way. Like you're not just perfecting what you thought you wanted to originally create, but you find some other thing that's a hidden gem that becomes more and more of who you are as an artist.
Yeah. I mean, if you make, say, 100 things over the course of however long you're working, at least one of those things is going to be amazing. And to your point, it might be something that was unexpected, or at first you're like, this is a mistake, but you just go with it because you make a weird line and you're like, well, actually, I didn't intend to make the line that way, but I really like where this is going, and you go with it and then you make some new discovery. So, and that's another beautiful thing about just showing up and practicing the thing, is that you're always going to be like making discoveries along the way that lead you in new directions that you never expected.
Yeah. So I'm trying to get into the head of the listener and thinking she's hearing your story. Yes, you started your former career as an artist later, but you were still not quite 40. So relative to where we are now, that feels young, right? So what do you say to her, whether it's that she wants to perfect her craft as an artist, or she's just getting started in some other capacity? What do you say to her about that messy period and that time that she needs to put in when she's already feeling in her life like, is it too late? Did I miss the boat? What do you say to her?
Well, my main message is it's not too late. It's never too late. And there's so many examples of that in the world. I think that like as older women in particular, we have like more wisdom and grit and like ability to persevere to get through that messy period than most people in their teens, 20s, and 30s, because we've lived a whole life. And I think part of what helped me even in my 40s as I was really building my career was that I had already done so much with my life. I mean, not necessarily anything of note, but like I had gotten up and gone to work every day and dealt with bosses and coworkers and disappointed people who were disappointed in me and like having to like get feedback on things and do things over again for somebody who was unhappy with something that I had delivered. And like, I had just kind of been through it. And so this idea that like I was potentially going to make some bad art for a while felt like nothing compared to a lot of the things I had already been through in my life. And like, it felt like kind of an honor and a privilege to be able to show up and just like, get to mess around with art materials. And, I was giving a talk once in Pittsburgh. Um, I was on a book tour actually for Find Your Artistic Voice back in
Uh-huh.
2019. And a woman stood up and her voice was shaking, and it was during the Q&A afterwards. And she said, like, what do you say to somebody and she was clearly talking about herself, who's like, I'm this many years old and, you know, blah, 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 and naming all these things. And I said, you you have lived a whole life, and like you have more of everything than most people in this room who are younger than you. And I really encourage people to think of all of those things as strengths. They aren't necessarily going to make you a better artist than
Yeah.
somebody else in terms of like the inventiveness or quality of your work, but they will allow you to like potentially build a business if that's what you want to do, or get through the messy parts where you're kind of like stuck in that area, that space of just like not knowing what to do next, or whether or not your work is any good, or whether you should continue on. I think that there's like a certain amount of grit and perseverance that we have that or at least that I have now that I didn't have when I was younger. I'm a avid cyclist and I race bikes now. I didn't start any of that until I was in my early 50s. And it's a huge part of my life now. And I remember in the beginning, I joined a cycling team, and one of the women was like, you should race. And I thought, God, no, why would I? Like, I would never do that. Like, I could never possibly be good enough or strong enough to do that. And what I realized is that like anybody can race a bike. You don't have to be fast. You just have to do it because you want to race a bike. And that's the great thing about most bike races that are not elite races, is that anybody can show up and participate. You just have to like riding a bike and know how to ride a bike. But eventually I like found so much like just a sense of community and joy in this outside of work activity that I had found, friendships and all of these things. And I also found that I had um, this ability to show up and like do super hard workouts and like um and be consistent and be disciplined that I never would have had in my 20s, even if I had discovered that I was a good cyclist. Um, and that really served me well. And I think so much of that has to do with like my age and my life experience. And is my VO2 max going to be the same as it would have been 20 years ago? Definitely not. But I can show up and work really hard. And
Yeah.
I think that is 100% related to where I am at this phase in my life. And then I'm also making space for something that I love and giving myself permission to do that outside of my art career, which I also love.
Yeah.
So,
I love that as we get older, all the parts of our life give us muscle memory for whatever. Like you talked
yes,
about grit and resilience. And so perhaps it wasn't in whatever this new endeavor is, but it's like, I know I can count on her. I can count on
yes,
myself.
I
She's
got
going to be
this.
able to get through this. She's
Yeah.
got this. So for you personally, what would you say your age, as you look at your career now? You gave us a great example of cycling and you beat me to the punch. I was going to ask you about that. um, but what would you say, how is your age an asset now when you think about your career, your time as an artist, your time as, I would say, even a mentor and teacher? Because so many people are even if you're not formally mentoring and teaching, people are looking and watching and seeing what you have done. um, how is that serving you now? How is that an asset now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I definitely, it's not lost on me that because I am older, that people come to me for advice, and that there's a certain kind of respect that my opinion gets. I think partly because of my age, and even though I got a late start, you pointed out that I was still pretty young when I started.
Yeah.
I was in my 30s when I started making art. I really launched my career when I was about 39 or 40. And so, I've been doing it a long time, almost 20 years. And so it's weird because I got a late start, but I've also been at it for a long time.
Yeah.
And so I think the combination of those things has 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 helped me. And I think that like other women who are in midlife and older, who are looking for someone to learn from, I'm a really great person for them to look to because I didn't start when I was 22 or even 32, really. Um, and I have had some success. Like I did the
Yeah,
thing
I'd say.
and I made and I did it in a way that's really worked for me. And it's interesting. I'm like closer to retirement now than obviously than to when I started. And I think, people are always asking me what's next, and I'm like, retirement.
Yeah.
That's probably going to look different for me than for a lot of people
I was going
because
to
I'm
ask
never
you,
going to
what will that
stop
look
making
like for
art.
you? Yeah. Yeah.
But, I think right now the like biggest part of my business that is like the hardest to manage is the retail part of my business. I have 2.5 employees, two full-time and one part-time employee who run that whole part of my business for me. And I still design all the products and everything, but they do most of the work in the
And
retail part
just
of the
for our
business.
audience that doesn't know, that's like the calendars and the journals and some tabletop
The
goods
the
and all of
books
it.
and the
Yeah.
greeting cards, and
Yeah.
I have like a prints and posters and
Yeah.
all kinds of things. And I also have a shop in Portland, Oregon, a retail, like an in-person shop. And so I think the first phase of that looks like just shutting that down. And my employees already know that, that I'm like headed toward retirement in 4 or 5 years, or at least closing that part of the business. They're both of my employees, I'm actually all three of them are women in their 40s. Um, and my oldest employee is 10 years younger than I am. And they're still going to have some working time left. And I've really made a commitment to them to help them navigate that. We're
Wow.
kind of like a family. And it feels really important to me because I have invested a lot in them and their professional development and their what they do every day. And I want to see them go on to do something else after that business closes. I will probably continue for a few years to do projects, special projects, and some client work. I will never stop painting and drawing, and I love building bodies of work and having art shows. So that's
Yeah.
probably something that I will continue to do probably into my 80s. Mostly, though, I'm going to ride my bike and get in even better shape than I am now because I'm going to have more time to train. So,
That's
yeah.
amazing. I love that. You're such an inspiration in the way you um give us, I think, hope for what's possible. And I think even giving some really practical ways of for us to discover that possibility, artist or not, putting in the time, that's for anybody. You want to bake, you want to open a cupcake shop, you want to become a photographer, you want to, learn how to ride a bike for the first time, you want to go into finance. Like it's about putting in the time, being willing to be messy. And I think that can be hard at our age. Like perhaps our ego is really intact around something else. So how do we step
Yeah.
away from that
Yeah.
and be willing to start over and be willing to be a
Yeah.
student again? And I think you're showing us that.
Oh, well, thank you. I wrote this book back in 2016 or so called A Glorious Freedom and Older Women Leading Extraordinary Lives. And it's basically a collection of essays about interviews with and like profiles of women over 40, which a lot of people were like over 40 because 40 feels so young,
Woo!
right?
Yeah, 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 yeah.
But like who sort of hit the apex of their career later in
Yeah.
life or started something. It's like examples, and it was really very much sort of based on my own story and like interest in that. And the title comes from this essay by Caroline Paul, and she was talking about learning to surf when she was 50, I think, and which was a while back. I think she's like in her early 60s now. But she was telling this story about how like she went in to order some food or something in a kiosk like close to where she was surfing, and like how the young teenage boy working there sort of looked right past her.
Mm.
But there is a glorious freedom in like being old, that you're not, that people aren't like we're so youth
You don't have to
obsessed.
perform. You're
That's
not
right.
performing for
That's right.
anybody. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Or that like that this idea of not being noticed as a woman, like, we're so objectified, our entire lives. We're not enough, we're just right, or we're too much, we're all the things. But it's always about, where we fit into that. And then at a certain age, you're sort of graduate out of that window, right? And you can, and there is a certain sort of freedom in that, right? I mean, I think some women really mourn it, being, not being young anymore, and their body's changing and their face is changing and all of that. But like, there is a certain freedom in it because we're not objectified in the same way. And I loved that line, so I ended up asking her if I could use it as the title for my book. And I think there is a certain freedom in being older, and like, we don't necessarily have to adhere to any sort of rules anymore, and we can go start over. We can go do a thing. And I did it when I was in my 40s, but certainly I know a lot of women, and I know of a lot of women who are doing those things in their 50s, 60s, 70s, et cetera. And that in some ways, the older you get, the more freedom you have.
Yeah. Yeah. Amen. I love that. I would love to just end the podcast here, but I have one last question for you. That was great. Thank you for sharing that. And we'll make sure and link to the various book titles and your shop, but that one in particular. This podcast is called Liberty Road. The intention is that we're helping women liberate those dreams that they have and perhaps didn't pursue earlier in life. What has becoming an artist, and I would say through your books and through teaching others, even the employees you talked about, like really passing the baton, what has that done to liberate you, Lisa, the woman?
It's interesting. Like I definitely think a lot about what I want my legacy to be, because I'm very in touch with my mortality, right? Like that. I think the older you get, and the more you go through menopause, which I did 5 years ago, like like everything that was once intact just starts unraveling in a way.
Yeah.
And so you have this physical manifestation of aging that some people might get younger and some people might get older, but for most of us, it happens in our 50s. And so like, there's that, and I'm very in my body because I'm an athlete. And so I notice these things pretty profoundly. So that's been, and just sort of like accepting that and not fighting it, and it has really been a profound process of freedom for me. And I think also like, I went through this really interesting process about 3 years ago, and I really did a lot of like thinking about my life, and at that point I was really kind of overcommitted, and I'm a recovering people pleaser, right? And I think a lot of women from our generation, we were raised to believe that like we should please others and always say yes and like sign up for all the things, and that like you can do it all, and that, the busier you are, the better. And I had been living and breathing this for years. I was on like 3 or 4 boards of directors, and I was, running this business, and had all these friendships that didn't even matter to me at the end of the day because they were with people that weren't really showing up for me. And like, and I just did this inventory of like all of the things in my life that felt obligatory or weren't bringing me joy. And I systematically, from that day forward, just started figuring out ways to cut all of them out of my life or quit them. And I wrote this Instagram post about it, and which went viral because I obviously resonated with a lot of people. And I don't think just people in midlife, but like just people in general. We always kind of, sometimes we wake up and we're like, what am I doing, with my time?
Hopefully we have that moment. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I ended up like, I realized that I do a lot of work on values in my own life, and published a a deck called the values deck where people can sort their values and kind of figure out what matters most to them. And I had done a lot of that work. And one of the things that just kept coming up for me was spaciousness. Like I needed more spaciousness in my life because I wanted the freedom to ideate and to not have to rush anymore and to like have free time in the evenings and to actually have a boring life. Like I had been craving this and I was like, I am, at the time I was like 55 and I was like, I'm 55 years old. And I want that freedom and I can do that. Like nobody, I'm the one putting this pressure on myself to do all the things and to show up for all the things. Like I'm the one who's responsible. Am I going to disappoint some people in the process? 100%. Sure. But I got to do this for me. And I did, and ended up being fine. And we always imagine that we're going to disappoint people way more than we do. And if we do, we usually, sort of figure out a way to work through it. And so for me, this this act of sort of like extricating myself from all of these responsibilities, this like act of kind of like slowly embracing the wrinkles on my face and the, pooch in my belly that didn't exist before and like all the things that were changing about my life as, were really just like acts of liberation, really, from like all of the responsibility or the sense of having to be or live a certain way. And there is a real freedom in that. And for me, that's sort of what it looks like. And I'm really excited to see what it looks like next for me too. Like I'm just really starting this process in my 50s and it's slowly unfolding. And I think there's a lot more layers to like unpack. And we could be having a conversation in 3 years and I could have a whole new story for you. I really do believe that. So.
Well, let's do.
Yeah.
Let's have a conversation in 3 years. Thank you, Lisa, for showing up in so many ways. I thought this was going to be much more about your art, and it was, but I feel like you've given us so much about just life and a very honest but optimistic outlook on what's next for us. It feels sobering in the good way, right? Versus just that, isn't aging great? It's all great. No, there's a lot
it's not.
There's a lot of stuff that's actually really hard. And whether it's connecting with, as you said, like our mortality or all the things that aren't working the same way. I think the beauty in it, and you've outlined this for us, and it's something I believe, is that when we become really clear about how much time we have left, we start to make really good decisions about how to use that time. And that's the beauty of that sobering up to our age. That's the magic, actually, or where the magic can happen.
I agree. I have a half brother who just passed away a few weeks ago in his sleep.
I'm sorry.
Of a cardiac. No, it's fine. And I haven't talked about it publicly, but it was really hard. But I also, it was one of those things that was sort of devastating for my family, but at the same time, like it made me realize like life is short. And he was in his early 60s. He's older than me. But he lived life to the fullest and he, fortunately he died painlessly in his sleep, but like, and he had no idea he had a heart condition, like all of these things, but like, you just don't know what's going to happen. And the older you get, the chances of something like that happening are more intense. And while that can feel very scary and it certainly causes me anxiety from time to time, I also want to use that as like the fuel to like continue to do all of the things that are important to me, because that's what my brother did, right? Like, and so I feel every time something like that happens where I'm sort of faced with the mortality of somebody that I know who's in my age range, or, somebody I know has something age-related happen, while that's scary, I think it's also like fuel and can be fuel for all of us to just continue to live our lives,
Yeah. What a gift for
what a
him
gift
to give that to you.
Yes.
And then as you think about your own legacy, gives you some sort of guardrails as to the way you want to live and the way you want to um, inspire others to live.
Yeah.
What a
Yeah,
gift.
definitely.
Thank you, Lisa. Thanks for
Yeah.
hanging out with us. I
Yeah.
appreciate it.
It's been so great, and I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yes, me too. And Liberty listeners, thank you guys for hanging out with Lisa and with me. Like I said, we'll have links in the show notes to all the things she mentioned, her books, her store. And if you're ever up in Portland, definitely give her a swing by and give her a visit. And we will talk to you guys next week. Bye for now.